Well then, today we want to continue with our analysis of Nietzsche's thought, but hopefully we can also begin our critical assessment of Nietzsche, what's valid and what's invalid. And remember, next time we hope to spend a session on Sartre, and then our last 4 sessions, 3 on air and 1 a summary on moral debate. But let's proceed with Nietzsche. Now, the first thing to note, and I think this is valid on Nietzsche's point, he said on his part that we have to look at human psychology with an unprejudiced eye. And I've often encountered this in my own research. That is, psychology is a discipline which is very much on the verge of political correctness or incorrectness. Because what you find out about human nature, and particularly the respective roles of genes and environment, arouse very strong emotions. And Nietzsche says up to now we haven't wanted to look at the darker aspects of human psychology. He thinks, of course, as we'll see in a moment, that all of our actions are motivated by the will to power. And he will try and tell us that we like to gild the lily by pretending that we have altruistic motives, but really manipulating other people is our deepest desire. Now, we'll leave that on the shelf for a moment because I think that's an oversimplification, but he's certainly correct. In modern psychology, for example, if you investigate racial differences, you're almost immediately considered suspect. And yet these are something that we have to understand if we want to understand the world around us. Different races, for example, differ in terms of their resistance to disease. That is, Africans are more susceptible to sickle cell anemia. Other racial groups have other peculiarities in terms of their resistance to illness. We do have separate evolutionary histories. They're not watertight, of course, but you don't need a watertight evolutionary history to differentiate races in order to find differences. Even relatively recent things can influence the genetic differences between races. Let us imagine, for example, that for the last 300 years in a particular society, people with very little education have outbred those with high education. And in another society, it's been very different. Well, even if they were of the same race, you would expect a difference in their quality for genes for intelligence. That is, this is assuming, of course, that there's open mobility in the societies. Well, if there's open mobility in the two societies, then intelligence counts to some degree as to whether you get more education. And if in one society those who get more education have been outbreeding those who get less, you would assume that the quality for intelligence of genes in that society has escalated. If in another society those who get less education have outbred those who have got more, you would assume that to some degree the genes for intelligence had degenerated in that society. We all recognize this in terms of breeding plants or animals. We all recognize it to some degree in terms of breeding humans. I take it behind the Iron Curtain at one time, when they really wanted to produce super athletes, they encouraged champions in a particular discipline to take on a mate who is also a champion in that discipline, did they not? They assumed that if people who are good at a certain athletic talent left behind lots of offsprings, they'd have a bigger pool of talented individuals to choose from, did they not? So, like it or not, we have to face possible genetic differences between human groups with an unprejudiced eye. And it's interesting to me how many universities in America, when I visited them, had no courses on intelligence. And if you ask them why, they would say, well, you lose both ways. Some student is sure to ask whether there are genetic differences between black and white for intelligence. And once you ask that question, if you say, well, there may be a genetic component in the difference, then of course you're branded as a racist. But if you try to give an environmental explanation, you're probably going to be branded as a racist, because everyone knows that blacks have a much more difficult time interfacing with the U.S. educational system than white. That is, far fewer of them qualify for Harvard and for elite universities. Now, if you're to give an environmental explanation as to why blacks do badly, you'll probably have to say that on some level at least, black culture is less cognitively demanding than white culture. After all, if a culture doesn't demand that you exercise a particular facility, you don't get as good at it. There's no doubt that Jewish culture places much less emphasis on becoming a professional athlete than Irish American culture. And of course, that's a fairly tame difference, isn't it? Who cares? But if you said that Irish culture did not put the same emphasis on cognitive development as Jewish culture, that is a very, very politically loaded statement, is it not? So I think that we have to take into account that what Nietzsche says is true. How many people have a full and frank discussion of the history of Maori in New Zealand? Because, again, you feel politically explosive findings. I've talked to Maori from the Waikato who point out that of all Maori tribal groups, they are at present the group that is perhaps furthest behind in terms of their social and educational and economic development. And they say this has a great deal to do with how they were enslaved by other Maori tribes in historical times. Well, maybe true, but of course it's not politic to say it, is it? It's not politic to say that you may have to have a group make adjustments in its culture in order to interface with the educational system. Irish Americans had a tradition of land hunger, and therefore they wanted to own their own homes. And therefore they tended to put their sons in factory work as soon as the school leaving age occurred. While Chinese Americans were from the tradition in China that you used education as an avenue of upward social mobility. The brightest kid in school might become a Mandarin through the Chinese examination system and thereby become a patron for your local village. So Chinese Americans, rather than putting their sons and daughters into work at the age of 16, might have them at home doing family businesses, but they would be going on with their education, you see. Well, here again, you're said to be blaming the victim. Are we not indicting Irish culture and saying that it is responsible for Irish making less social progress in America than Chinese Americans? And of course, an analysis of Maori and Pakeha in New Zealand has to take into account the differences in culture of these groups. That is, you have to ask yourself why Maori are having more difficulty interfacing with the educational system than Europeans. I don't think they have any less genetic talent. I don't think it's overt discrimination in school today, though it probably was 50 years ago. You have to ask yourself what cultural patterns might have to be modified in Maori society if they were to interface as successfully as Europeans were. So we see Nietzsche's point. I mean, without being a Nietzschean, you can say that psychology is a discipline that ought to study human behavior with the hope of finding truth, not with the hope of finding politically acceptable conclusions. And of course, if you ignore the real world, you pay a price, do you not? That is, if we ever hope to cure certain social ills, we have to know what really causes them. And if we have left out part of the causality through our sensitivity, we never will know what really causes them. Unless you know the causes, you can hardly eliminate the effects. So unless you know what caused Irish to perform less well than Chinese when they were both immigrant groups in America, you're going to have a very hard time closing the gap. So you always pay a price for ignoring the real world. And therefore, Nietzsche's admonition that psychology should look at the real world with an unprejudiced eye is undoubtedly valid. What about his notions about what corrupts the Superman? As we know, Nietzsche thinks that if you look at human psychology with an unprejudiced eye, you will see that certain people have a capacity for creative genius that most of us lack. And he would say, if you prefer the mediocre to the great, that is your problem, but I prefer the great to the mediocre. And you remember that herd people try to use herd morality to tame supermen. and to give them moral reservations about what they need to do to realize their creative potential. But that is only one thing that might distract a Superman from the uninhibited search for his or her own excellence. And let's look at some of them. Temptations that are to be resisted. The adolescent sense of liberation. You remember the brothers Karamazov, Smerdyakov, once he realizes that there is no objective morality and that he is really free to do whatever he wants, you know, that he has this freedom from conventional morality to express himself, all he can think to do is to murder his father, whom he hated. Well, this is not what Nietzsche has in mind. He would say to Smerdyakov, for heaven's sakes, haven't you got over that? You know, if you had to disobey conventional morality in order to paint a great picture or to design a great cathedral, that's one thing. But if the best thing you can think to do with this new freedom is to murder your father because you hold a grudge, I won't criticize you morally, but that certainly is a rather trivial motive. So the adolescent sense of liberation, to do the outrageous, is a distraction from becoming a Superman. Remember again, sadism is a distraction from becoming a Superman. You may feel, since there's no conventional morality, I have the right to torture people who are more suggestible and weaker than myself. Well, that again would be an ignoble motive. It would have nothing to do with becoming a Superman. Cosmopolitan humanism is a much greater snare. That is, you may waste all of your efforts, like Albert Schweitzer, in trying to cure leprosy in Africa, when you really were a talented musician. I take it that Schweitzer was a great performer on the organ, and he composed music. And Nietzsche would say, do you really think that we want less of the genius of a great person so they can go out and do what any medical missionary could do, and that is run a leprosy asylum in Africa? You know, is this the sort of thing that should distract a Superman, as a sort of humanitarianism where they waste their lives, you know, drying people's eyes and helping them blow their noses? Or shouldn't they really do something great? So a cosmopolitan humanism can distract you from being a Superman. He says you should welcome slavery, harshness, and everything snake-like in man, because your test is not reducing human suffering, it's what kind of environment produces great art. And Nietzsche thinks that great art comes when there are tensions in society. And tensions in society are actually encouraged by things like slavery and wickedness. Love of a person can be a distraction. There are many aphorisms in Nietzsche that are anti-women. Now, some of these we should regard as merely a metaphor. That is, often Nietzsche, when he talks about women, means what he considers womanish in human nature. And that has nothing to do with gender. He's talking about sentimentalism of the type you find in Dickens's novels. It was once remarked that Dickens couldn't make a character virtuous without making them either stupid or silly, or somehow permanently immature, like Little Dorrit. You know, Little Dorrit never really grows up, does she? And yet she's supposed to be an idol of innocent womanhood. Or there's the character who's doing the Greek dictionary, who never gets beyond the letter B, who's supposed to be very virtuous, but is really an old fool, is he not? And he says, you know, Nietzsche's idea of virtue is essentially that you have to be an imbecile or a child. And he says this sort of thing is what is womanish in human beings. The sort of Quaker who can't believe in helping humanity unless they gild human nature and see human nature as more perfect than it really is. And now other occasions, however, he's not talking about what is sentimental in human beings. He does seem to be talking about the gender, and that I can't defend his aphorisms. He has a number of aphorisms that imply that women are unusually, compared to men, susceptible to self-flattery. that women tell themselves a fairy tale about a good opinion of themselves and then are foolish enough to believe it. So some of the aphorisms do genuinely seem to be gender-oriented and not metaphorically oriented. Russell has a good time with Nietzsche in this respect. There are two of Nietzsche's aphorisms, one of which, women exist for the pleasure of the warrior. And then Russell remarks, some of the pleasures of the warrior were fairly exotic, because another aphorism is, thou goest to women, forget not thy whip. So some of this material just seems to be nonsensical. But there is a serious point behind many of the women aphorisms. The intoxication of a narrow dedication to science can be a distraction for the Superman. You know, the person who becomes obsessed with, let's say, having a proper account of the evolution of barnacles, as Darwin did, or something of this sort. He doesn't mind you pursuing science, because science is a creative activity. But humdrum science can be a distraction. Patriotic drivel is a temptation that distracts you from becoming a Superman. This, of course, is against the stereotype many people have of Nietzsche. He was a fierce opponent of anti-Semitism. His sister was an anti-Semite and tried after his death to edit his works, to turn him into an anti-Semite and his papers that he left behind. But Nietzsche himself loathed anti-Semitism. He said anti-Semitism was merely an attempt on the Germans to find an excuse for their own failure to achieve. They blame every failure on the Jews. And he himself had none of this at all. He talks about the obscenity of making the Jews a scapegoat, that this is the bane of the German character, and shows how inferior Germans are to Jews. He says they realize the Jews are actually tougher than they are and can outcompete them. And this is the root of their anti-Semitism, this type of obscenity of Jews being a scapegoat for every public mishap. He criticizes the English. This has nothing to do with anti-Semitism, but it has to do with national character. And he says, just as the Jews are by no means the most civilized race in Europe, he reserves that for the French, the English are even a step further down. And they're a step further down, of course, first because they're the home of utilitarianism. I take it this is John Stuart Mill, that the good is the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Well, of course, from Nietzsche's point of view, that's the essence of a herd morality, isn't it? That every human being counts as much as every other human being, and you seek the happiness of the village idiot as much as you would seek the happiness of a great genius. So he loathes British philosophy. He talks about Carlyle, the sort of grimaces that he would make. But he said he saw some of the flaws in the English character, that at least Carlyle had a biased view of his own national group. And he then attacks English religion. He talks about that cattle herd of eccentrics and alcoholics who made moral moves under the tutelage of the Salvation Army and today follow the Methodists. And he says perhaps a penitential fit is the highest expression of the English character. And he ends with a criticism of how English women walk. Apparently they walk less gracefully than French women. As an Irishman, I have a certain amount of sympathy with some of Nietzsche's remarks on the English. Well then, the final thing is that, of course, you're not distracted by a belief in God. You don't take religion seriously. I take it religion is merely something to manipulate the masses. I mean, you may become a bishop in the medieval times because this gives you power and gives you, again, let's say, the power to hire a great architect to build a great cathedral. But you yourself do not take it seriously. It's merely a tool for manipulating the masses. Any questions, then, about Nietzsche's ideal Superman and what he means when he says they should liberate themselves not only from conventional morality, but from everything that would distract them from their mission of great achievement or their mission of self-perfection? Back there first.
Me?
Yep.
They talk about supermen. Can there be superwoman as well?
There can be. Nietzsche never mentions any, however. I mean, we have to here, I think, to detach Nietzsche's ideology from his prejudices. It's hard to see why Madame Curie wouldn't have qualified as a proto-Superman, isn't it? Or some of the great figures of the Bronte sisters, for example. When he lists proto-Superman, I never find him listing women. Some of them are just nasty pieces of work, like Alcibiades, who certainly was active in Greek politics and had no moral scruple, but I can't see what great purpose he had in mind. Some of them are like Frederick IV of Hohenstaufen, who was certainly a treacherous diplomat and did build modern Prussia against great odds, but again, I'm not sure what greatness is. The other people he names as proto-supermen were great. Michelangelo, Goethe, Raphael. These people were undoubtedly great geniuses. Oddly enough, we find almost nothing on the science or mathematics side. That is, he doesn't seem to name Newton or Gauss, the greatest mathematician who ever lived. They seem to be mainly literary figures, great sculptors, great painters, great architects, plus the generals, of course, the great generals. Napoleon was a proto-Superman because he had a vision of recreating Europe. Well, there's some truth in that, he did try to recreate Europe. So you get a very odd bag of people who are the proto-supermen. It omits women, it omits scientists and mathematicians. It runs very much to the political, to the military, and to the arts.
It seems to me that sometimes, especially towards the end of the book, that he's defining supermen as basically people who agree with him. Which, I mean, would you agree with that?
They have to agree with him about ethics, or they'll be distracted from the task of becoming a superman. That's true. In other words, people who were potential supermen like Schweitzer accepted herd ethics, and look what became of them. But you do have to have genuine talent. You can't be just the sort of fool who in Greenwich Village says, I'm a superman, and what's his proof that he's a superman? Namely, that he paints himself blue and rolls across a canvas. And so there are ersatz supermen who might accept Nietzsche's ethics, but they just don't have the talent. Back there.
Would he have accepted someone as a superman?
Pardon?
Would he have accepted someone as a superman if they had achieved in spite of immorality? Something like Plato, who was
I think he would consider them like Trotsky did the Soviet Union. He said the Soviet Union was a degenerate worker state. Someone who was like Einstein, who was obviously a creative genius, but who had a great sense of cosmopolitan humanism, I presume would be a flawed or misguided superman. To really be a superman, you would have to have not only creative talent, but you would have to recognize that supermen owe justice only to one another, and that they should support one another, and again, not champion the ordinary man. But I think Nietzsche would say, I'm not a prey to words. I'm not saying something so stupid as that a person who accepts herd morality can't be a creative genius. They can be.
Does Nietzsche dismiss religion as a distraction to everybody, or just to Superman?
Oh no, herd men probably need it. In other words, they're not strong enough to face the fact that they won't survive death. They need something to justify their own importance, namely that they have a soul. That doesn't mean it's true. It's no more true than any other metaphysical doctrine. As we have seen, a rational person will reject all transcendental entities, including God and heaven. But in terms of need, it may well be, and it may well be that no Superman should ever try to eliminate religious belief from the masses, because it can always be a useful instrument of control.
I just want to make this clear. About women, it was kind of... God, I lost the chain of thought for a second. No.
Is this Nietzsche's views on women?
Oh yeah, that's the thing, yeah. Nietzsche's views on women. From what I understand, he's saying that really from his own male perspective. He's seen the women do this, but as he can't really speak for them honestly, because as you mentioned before, he hasn't listed a superwoman, but I can actually think of an example like Empress Wu of China, basically made China the great middle kingdom in Asia.
Oh, yes.
Through use of Buddhism, so yeah.
Yeah, it's odd. Also, the supermen he lists are almost all European products. I mean, he doesn't seem to find, you know, super people beyond the European orbit. I can only assume that this is his own cultural blinkers. I mean, since he was a product of European civilization, he seems to have just filtered out anything else. And as I say, often it's quite clear that he is not talking about women in some of these aphorisms. He's talking about sentimentality. But in other aphorisms, it's peculiar, and it's certainly strange that he doesn't list any women as supermen. He's not like Plato. Plato, you recall, despite living in a time in which discrimination against women was rife, thought that women should wrestle in the nude and, you know, should be treated as men the same in the educational system, and that there would be women philosopher kings. You know, he's quite explicit on this. He seems to think there'll be fewer than there will be men, so he's not entirely in accord with modern temper, but he's a world removed from someone like Nietzsche. Any other questions about Nietzsche's ideal?
To what extent does he think Superman should risk their own life or something like that in order to produce great work?
I don't think he would object to that if it was necessary. You wouldn't sell your life lightly, because if you lost it, your future production is going to go down the drain, isn't it? But I suspect that under certain conditions, I presume that if you're up on a scaffold painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, and let's assume you're getting fairly well on in years, there's some risk in that, isn't there? And you'd have to balance the risk against the greatness of the product. Certainly it wasn't without risk, as we know. Over here.
How did Nietzsche justify his own status as a Superman?
Well, he never lists himself as a Superman, but I don't think there's much doubt that he thought he was. He certainly thought he had the right ethic, didn't he? He qualified on those grounds. And I will go so far as to say that Nietzsche is one of the 100 geniuses, you know, that the 19th and 20th century produced. I haven't really been able to give Nietzsche to show you his intellectual brilliance. But some of the passages in Nietzsche where he criticized Cartesian metaphysics or materialistic metaphysics are extremely acute. There's a passage in there where he anticipates Russell in pointing out that belief in transcendental metaphysics has a great deal to do with language, you know, the subject-predicate structures of sentences. I'm not saying that Nietzsche suffered from false modesty. I don't think he did. But I would certainly list him as a proto-Superman according to his own criteria. Nietzsche was a great thinker. It's unfortunate that the content of his ethics is as vicious as it is. And when we get to criticism of Nietzsche, I think I will show you that a humane person can make a certain case in terms of reason and evidence against his ethics. But remember, we cannot refute him in the sense we could if we had a truth test up our sleeve. You know, if you have a truth test up your sleeve, you can show that someone is just wrong and they ought to change their views. What we'll be able to show about Nietzsche is not that we can refute him, like showing that a hallucination is deceptive. All we can do is show him that his ideals in many ways were unworkable in practice, and that you couldn't organize a human society using them. Now that, of course, is only a half victory, isn't it? Because it may leave him demoralized about what he would do to structure a society of the sort that he admired, but it still leaves the Superman capable of functioning as an individual beyond morality. You see, I have a much easier time making a case against Nietzsche's ideal society, which we'll get to in a moment. But merely because I can show his ideal society is unworkable doesn't mean that I can show him that he ought not to pursue his personal ethics. His views about how to bring a cosmopolitan Europe ruled by supermen may be a lot of nonsense. But he would say, okay, you've refuted me on that level, but I still stick to my guns. If an artist is broke and needs money for paint and canvas and murders a bum in an alley who has stolen a wallet, you know, then what can you say against that? And I can't say much against it without a truth test in ethics. Fundamentally, all moral principles come from within. You can show someone that their ideals are logically incoherent. You can show someone that their notion of how to build a society in accord with their ideals is bankrupt. But that does not change their heart. That is, that doesn't give them a sympathy for the sufferings of ordinary people. There's nothing you can do with logic and science to create that psychological change in a person. I can refute Horatius's views about blacks. You know, I can show him he's wrong, that blacks are not genetically inferior, that all of his stereotypes are mistaken. I can't make him stop hating blacks. You know, that's a whole different ball game, isn't it? Your deepest hates and likes are not reached by logic. We can try and change them through what we call praxis. That is, rather than reasoning with you logically, we can try to confront you with cases that make your stereotypes seem invalid. This is what Martin Luther King did in the American South. I mean, of course he used all the arguments against black racial inferiority that were in the literature. But what he did fundamentally was that he presented white Southerners with blacks behaving in a way that they couldn't accommodate in their stereotype. You know, blacks were supposed to be childlike and incapable of discipline and incapable of running their own lives. Well, what did he do? He organized a bus boycott, which showed black people being willing to be beaten up, thrown through plate glass windows without retaliating in order to pursue their objective of getting fair treatment on the buses. They organized a complicated carpool. They walked miles to work, you know, to avoid using the buses. In other words, they demonstrated maturity, the ability to be adult, to have self-discipline. They demonstrated by their behavior all of the things that they were supposed to be incapable of, did they not? You see the point. So sometimes if you want to change an anti-humane person, you have to abandon the search for truth, that is logic and science, and just present them with an example that their worldview can't accommodate. They can, of course, just refuse to look at it. You know, in the long run, some people are hopeless. There's no doubt how, you remember the person who thought the earth was flat, and they took him up in the airplane, and when he saw the curvature of the earth, he said it was an optical illusion. So just as you can't convince this desk to be rational, there are some people who are beyond rationality because their emotions just overpower their reason to an extraordinary degree. But when we see how I would at least argue with Nietzsche, I have no way of changing Nietzsche's distaste for the average person and his worship for the great. You know, that's beyond the reach of anything I can say in terms of reason and evidence. Makes us nostalgic for Plato, you know, having some truth test laid up in heaven that should show that he was mistaken. I can't show that he ought to change his ideals. I can only show him inconsistencies in his ideals and that he is incapable of organizing a human society according to his ideals. Beyond that, I can't use reason and evidence. But it's worth doing. You know, it takes the wind out of his sails, certainly, as an ideologue. What would be very nice, we've almost reached the point with racists where almost all of them have to admit that you can organize a human society and give blacks a square deal. And we're now down to the hardcore of racists who have myths about miscegenation and mating with blacks, you know, the real Neanderthals. But racism as an ideology to organize a human society is now receding, isn't it? So progress is not inconsequential. Even if we can't win one big victory. You can win a lot of piecemeal victories that force people into a corner. Okay, Now, this has brought me into my next topic, as you can see. That is, I think the only way to deal with a thinker like Nietzsche is to go over his doctrines and see what is logically incoherent, and to show him that everyone, and I think Nietzsche and everyone has to agree with this, that no one can afford to admit that their moral system is logically incoherent. Because if you say, if you have incoherencies in your system, I don't even know what I'm buying into, do I? I often use the example of someone who says, well, I worship generosity. And then we see someone do a generous act, someone he dislikes, and he refuses to praise it. And we can then say to him, well, I thought you were telling me to worship generosity, but here is a generous act and you refuse to praise it. You know, what am I supposed to be buying into? Now, usually what they will do is to try and draw a weasel wording distinction. They will say, if you only knew my next door neighbor, you would realize that when he lends money, he expects it back at interest. Or even if he's given money away, it's only so the town will build a statue to him. You know, his acts may look generous, but he has non-generous motives. But then you may find that this particular person has actually endowed a charity abroad and has insisted that he be anonymous. Well, you see, now he has a much more difficult time, doesn't he, saying that he won't praise this person. In other words, his lack of logical his consistency is making his ethics a mishmash of nonsense. Anything that isn't logically consistent cannot really be presented to another person as worthy of acceptance. If a racist says that he hates black skin, and everyone who's black ought to go under, and I say, well, what if I put a pill in your food and turned your skin black? It puts him in a difficult position, does it not? Because he has to either say, well, there's at least one black person worthy of regard, namely me, because I now have a black skin, or he has to say it's not the black skin that makes people inferior, it's the empirical correlates with a black skin, that black-skinned people are, permanently immature, genetically inferior, and so on. But then he has to produce evidence, doesn't he? And the evidence is very likely going to go against him.
Can you just bite the bullet and accept that if he got black skin and he would be racist himself?
Well, but then you see he's paid another price. He's trivialized his doctrine. Imagine Hitler going to the German people, and Hitler, of course, was very racist as well as anti-Jewish. And imagine him telling the German people, when telling them what a great people they are, imagine something had got in the German water supply that turned all the German skin black. Is Hitler now to turn around and say, well, actually, you're not a great nation after all, just because you're black? I mean, he looked like an idiot, because what was supposed to make them a great nation was their great art, their great literature, blah, 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 wasn't it? It trivializes you. To be a skin color racist means that you're saying that all human traits are irrelevant to human quality except skin color. It's no difference whether you're bright, whether you have a sense of humor, whether you're a good companion. It would be like a book reviewer who said, now this book is worthy of a read because the dust jacket is white. And this book is not worthy of a read because the dust jacket is black. Well, you'd soon decide that this person was a lunatic, wouldn't you? Because they're not interested in whether the style is any good, whether the plot is any good, whether the characters come alive. And what would you think if the next day the book was put out with different colored dust jackets? Then he'd have to tell you the next day that the book he had recommended the previous day was no longer worth reading, wouldn't he? So you can see that logic and evidence can be a very powerful instrument against racists, is it not? Nietzsche is much tougher. Because to say to Nietzsche, what if you woke up one morning and became a herd person? He would have a ready answer, wouldn't he? He would say, well, then I'm no longer Nietzsche. If I give Hitler a pill and turn his skin black, he's still Hitler with a black skin, isn't he? And this is what gets him into trouble. The racist has to admit that now he's got a black skin, but he's just as intelligent and heroic a person as he was the night before. But to tell Nietzsche I put a pill in your, your highball at bedtime, and you woke up in the morning as a herd person, he'd say, well, of course I deserve to be exploited. Now I'm a herd person, I'm not Nietzsche anymore. It's like saying, what if you woke up as a Cocker Spaniel? Will you deserve the vote? Well, of course not. You don't deserve the vote. So Nietzsche, as you can see, is a much more difficult person to use logical consistency against. Because if you say, are you logically consistent? He would say, of course. Supermen ought to promote the domination of supermen, and herdmen ought to admire us so much as to collude in our domination. I don't expect them to do it, of course, because herdmen would never be capable of that type of discipline and self-sacrifice, but they ought to. So he would say there are no logical incoherences in my moral system. Now there are some we might catch him on. Sometimes I wonder what Nietzsche would have said in terms of ranking supermen, whether he attaches an absolute value to them or a relative value. Let us imagine tomorrow that everyone was a creative genius. Well, that would mean that certain supermen would have a tough time. That is, Napoleon could hardly raise an army, could he? That is, if he was a creative genius and the rest of us are cannon fodder, well, then he is justified in sacrificing us to his great vision. But if everyone else is a Superman, he's not justified in sacrificing any other human being to his great vision. So if you imagine a society entirely of Supermen, certainly the prerogatives that Supermen get as compared to the average person disappear, if he has an absolute standard. Now he might say, no, I had a relative standard. If everyone became a Superman, there'd be certain individuals who'd be Supermen. And I don't think he would say that, though. That type of choice takes a lot of the soul out of his doctrine. You get the impression that he admires Supermen not just for being the brightest people around today, but because they have reached a certain standard that he really admires.
But isn't it the case that the reason, like he says that Supermen owe justice only to other Supermen and herdmen owe justice only to other herdmen because they're equal?
That's right.
In a society where you've got Supermen and Supermen, wouldn't he then say, well, sure, the Supermen still owe justice to each other, but the Supermen don't owe any justice to them? He
could take that road. That, of course, would mean that potentially all the people he admires would now be cannon fodder. And he could pay that price. I don't know how he would choose. I don't want to bias the judgment. But I can imagine using logic to make Nietzsche choose. To say, if we imagine a society in which the people you admire are the average, would you be willing to see them exploited by someone who's now above average? He might say yes. One thing that is a much more difficult argument for him, if you really want to maximize human talent, to keep the mass of people illiterate is absurd. Because we all know in the Europe in which Nietzsche worked, hidden in the masses of people, were many potential geniuses that never had a chance. If you really want to maximize creative talent, the sort of strange caste society that Nietzsche has in mind, where there's a group of aristocrats who have the ability to develop their potential, and a group of herdmen who are ideally to be kept illiterate so they can be more easily manipulated, is to sacrifice an enormous reservoir of human talent. There's never been an aristocratic elite that where the average person was a genius. We find many cases in the British aristocracy where they were actually feeble-minded or silly, don't we? And in the masses of people in the 20th century, with universal education and universal literacy, all sorts of talent has come to the fore that the aristocrats of the 19th century never dreamed existed. Now you can always say, okay, Nietzsche now will have to say that we do have to give herdmen a chance to see if there are hidden supermen among them, and we'll have to give them essentially a decent way of life in order to pursue that. That, of course, gives herdmen an enormous power to resist supermen, doesn't it? That is, if you make them literate, well-educated, and well-organized, supermen are going to have a very difficult time pulling the strings behind the scenes. It means that they become a political force. This is what Nietzsche is afraid of. He says, you know, once they're literate, they demand the vote. And once they have the vote, you have a democratic society. And it's much more difficult to manipulate that type of society. We know today that he may have been too Pollyanna about this. It doesn't seem so difficult to manipulate that type of society at all. However, Nietzsche wouldn't like the people who do it, would he? That is, the people who manipulate a democratic society are hardly artistic geniuses like Michelangelo and Goethe. They tend to be spin doctors who tell politicians what to say, and pop stars and producers of bad mass entertainment. You know, Nietzsche admired the Brahmins, did he not? Because he said the Brahmins behind the scenes controlled Indian culture. Well, what sort of person behind the scenes controls our culture? I mean, it's hardly people like Albert Schweitzer and Bertrand Russell and Albert Einstein. The people behind the scenes who control our culture are the type of people that Nietzsche loathed. And that is people who are pop music stars, advertisers, spin doctors who advise politicians, people who know how to push the buttons of a democratic society so that people don't think. The same is true, I think, when Nietzsche said, well, one way towards a society dominated by supermen was conquest. Well, in his day, you could understand this. Napoleon was a genius in terms of the use of artillery. He went on the battlefield and he inspired his men. He was something of a heroic figure. Today, the modern military commander is something who runs something like a very complicated computerized dating club. You know, the generals behind America's conquest in Iraq didn't even get to Iraq. They sort of sat in a boardroom somewhere and moved things around on an operational map. You know, that was rather like having the talent of a business executive who is running a difficult computerized dating society. And even Schwarzkopf, who did get on the scene of battle, never hewed anyone down with a sword, or never got to see anyone in battle. He just sort of ordered tank divisions forward and had airplanes drop lethal things out of the sky, didn't they? That is, in our time, war doesn't seem to even mean that you need the military virtues much to be a general. You know, you don't even have to be brave. You have to be willing to see other people killed, you know, to commit people to battle. But if you're a five-star American general, when was the last time one of them was killed, or actually killed anybody? This notion that you prove something like the military virtues on the battlefield is a thing of the past, isn't it? The American military now is developing weapons, these, you know, unmanned little airplanes they have now that are all the thing. And they're hoping eventually to reduce them to the size of bees. So if you wanted to conquer a country like Iraq, you wouldn't suffer any casualties at all. You'd just send thousands of little motorized bees in to kill whoever you wanted. This takes much of the heroism out of war. And you get the distinct feeling that Nietzsche's heroic conqueror, who is supposed to be a person of unusual personality or talent, has really receded in the past in our time. And the person who was to be the cultural genius who pulled the strings behind the scenes, that has been debased. That is, the people who pull the cultural strings behind the scenes today are the mass media, and it's hard to have a heroic vision of them. So once you have social mobility in a society, I think you do maximize creative genius. In America, there are lots of creative artists and historians and what have you, but they don't rule. And they have powerful competitors now that make it almost impossible for them to influence the mainstream of society. So it doesn't seem to me that the recipes that Nietzsche gives as to how you would organize a Nietzschean society. Throughout most of human history, conquest has merely meant that you were horses fighting foot soldiers and that you had enough steel to make swords. It wasn't the more civilized people or the more creative people that won battles throughout even most of human history. Horsemen had a big advantage against farmers. So if you were on the fringes of a civilization and had steel swords and horses, you were very difficult to manage. That, of course, was until the invention of gunpowder. And then it becomes not the most heroic army, but the army with the most efficient industry that seems to, win wars, the one who has the most efficient steel workers. So the heroic image of creating a Superman society through conquest seems absurd. Well, next time I'll go on with my assessment of Nietzsche, because I think another difficulty for Nietzsche is not that he doesn't seem to have any scenario by which Supermen could dominate a human society. There's the problem of identifying Supermen that some of you raised earlier, and we'll want to look at that problem of identification a little more closely.